There we go. Yeah, we have some brilliant folks here today talking about what does women's homelessness and housing need in Canada really look like. As I know all of you on this call know, we're at this really critical moment in Canada, certainly with respect to COVID, but like a whole range of social issues that we're facing have really been illuminated in the last few months. And so, at least for myself, I feel like what's politically possible and feasible, like the horizon has changed. And I think it's changed for a lot of us in our practice, in our research, in our community-based work, in our government relations work. So it's kind of in that spirit of possibility that we wanted to do this webinar, bring together a sense of what we really found about women's homelessness and what it means for the future. So we have a large group, kind of a roundtable here today. I'm going to invite each of our panelists to kind of maybe join us on video and give us a wave. We're bringing together folks who have very diverse experiences, so it ranged from research to community-based work, lived expertise, folks who have been engaged on the ground, working on issues of violence against women, working on issues of women's homelessness. So excited that everyone is here. So maybe we'll start with, I think, Alex, could you give a little intro for yourself?
Hi, my name is Alex Nelson. Sorry, I don't have any video for you today. I will just try and entertain you with my voice. My pronouns are they, them, and I am a PhD student in anthropology at Western University and the co-chair of the Women's National Housing and Homelessness Network Lived Voices Working Group, as well as the LGBT2 SQ plus working group. And I'm happy to be here with you all. Thank you.
Thanks, Alex. Khulud, welcome.
Good. Hi everyone, Khulud Baig here from Keepers of the Circle. I work as the housing policy advisor and researcher with Keepers of the Circle, and have had the privilege to work with Caitlin and this wonderful team on the literature review and then on this presentation. Really happy to be here and really interested in the conversation and the questions that we're going to be receiving from people. So happy we have such a good turnout and excited to move forward.
Thanks so much, Khulud. And we have Alex Bridges here today.
Hello. Hi. So yeah, my name is Alexandra Bridges, and I'm the president of Keepers of the Circle. I am from originally near Timmins area, and I now live and work in the Timiskaming district. I have worked in Indigenous nonprofit for the past 15 years, and it's really something that a passion that I hold dear to my heart. And really, I'm just here from the community, from the programming experience that I have in having to deliver programming that is specifically geared towards women, Indigenous women and girls, and gender diverse people.
Thank you so much, Alexandra. And Hillary Chappell, our friend further out west.
Yes, hi everybody. I'm great. I'm really excited to be here. My first webinar, so this is going to be good. I'm Hillary Chappell from Calgary, Alberta. I identify by she and her. I'm a community advocate in Calgary and Alberta, and hopefully nationally too. I've been working with the network for a couple of years. I'm really excited about this, and I'll be doing my work on LGBTQ2S homelessness. Enjoy yourself, guys.
Beautiful, thank you. And Hannah, tell us about yourself.
Hi everyone, thanks for being here today. Such an honor to be presenting with these forces of nature here. I'm situated in Montreal, Quebec. I use she, her pronouns, and I work at the Oldbury Mission as the research coordinator. I'm also the co-chair on the policy and government relations working group within the network. Again, huge privilege. Thanks for being here.
Awesome, thanks so much, Hannah. And lastly, my name is Caitlin Schwan. I am the co-chair for the Women's National Housing and Homelessness Network. I'm senior researcher at the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness, so I've been working there a few years, and I've recently started working with Leilani Farha at The Shift, working on the right to housing. And this is one of my most favorite pieces I've ever written with an incredible group of people. So glad to be speaking with you today. Naveen, I think you covered all of the housekeeping, but if folks want, feel free to introduce yourself in the chat, add questions throughout. Like what our approach today would be to do kind of an hour presentations and then a half-hour Q&A, and feel free to pose anything. All the panelists will be able to offer their expertise. And Naveen is kind of going to move us through the PowerPoint, so you'll be hearing us say next a lot. So with that, Naveen, could you do the next slide? Awesome, perfect. So what we're talking about today is really these 3 documents that you're looking at. This is a series of work that we did over the last year and a half on behalf of the Women's National Housing and Homelessness Network. And you can access all of these on womenshomelessness.ca. Spoiler alert, they are very, very committed to the idea that we can end women's homelessness in Canada, and that we are facing 8 kind of key challenges and opportunities for doing that work. Slide, please. Thanks, Naveen. So just very quickly before we get into the findings, I thought it'd be helpful to give you a bit of a background on who the Women's National Housing and Homelessness Network is. We're actually a really large network, fairly new this year, bringing together a diverse coalition of folks with lived expertise, with practice experience, working in government, working at NGOs, a whole range of folks who are committed to the idea that we can prevent and end women's homelessness and homelessness for gender diverse folks across Canada. And so this is the network that commissioned this work. We hired the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness to do this work and kind of guided the work over the last year and a half. And slide, Naveen. Yeah, this is just to kind of give you a quick sense of some of the principles that are orienting our work. I mean, as you might expect, we are really deeply committed to the idea that lived experts need to be guiding policy and practice reform and working really closely with lived experts and their allies. We certainly take the human rights approach, very committed to equity, inclusivity, and you know, drawing in conversations around gender diverse folks, trans folks, and what their experiences of housing precarity and homelessness is. And a big focus of our work more recently has been the research piece. Next slide. And when we first came together as a network, we were thinking, okay, strategically, what makes sense for us to be doing at this initial point? And part of what we really identified was just the severe gaps in knowledge around women's homelessness in Canada. So a priority for us was really trying to get a sense of what do we know about women and girls homelessness, what don't we know, and so we kind of have been embarking on this large 3-phase research program of research. And part of the effort to do that was to try to mobilize and amplify the voices of lived experts. And specifically, we wanted to understand Indigenous women, girls, and gender diverse folks' experiences of homelessness and housing precarity, just because we know the severity of those challenges and really need to be working on building all of the data and evidence and advocacy we can to be seeing action in that area. Slide, please. So came together, decided this is our priority. We were able to bring the partners you see here together to have to develop this program of research. So the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness has been amazing, working with Canadian Observatory on Homelessness. Keepers of the Circle has been wonderful, leading our Indigenous work in this area. And all of this research has been made possible through CMHC, the Research and Planning Fund initiative. So enormous gratitude for all the folks who've supported to make this possible. Slide. And kind of very high level, just to show you what we've been up to and where we're going. This is a 3-phase project. So we're talking about phase 1 there, the literature review. But what is coming up for us, and for folks on the call who have interest in this area, I would be ecstatic to connect with you about this. we're doing a national survey on women's experiences of housing precarity and homelessness, really trying to get at hidden homelessness, trying to get at data that we haven't had in Canada before. So doing a large survey and then also doing a national consultation. And then our partners at Keepers of the Circle will be doing an Indigenous focused consultation with Indigenous women, girls, and gender diverse folks in phase 3. So Khulud and Alex will talk about that a little bit further. And now on to the exciting stuff. Next slide, please. Oh, okay. Well, this is exciting too. But this kind of gives you a sense of our research methodologies. We were really, yeah, I won't go into great detail. If you're a researcher on the call, we should chat, but spent a long time going through all of the academic literature, gray literature, looking at deputations, submissions to government, a whole range of data that we tried to bring together and triangulate. And we were really also looking at public systems to try to answer this question of what do we know about women's homelessness? What are the causes, consequences, kind of distinct pathways that we know women in Canada are flowing through in their experiences of housing? And again, really trying to draw specific evidence out around Indigenous women and girls' experiences. And slide. Thank you. Okay, so this is the good stuff. This is the fun stuff. The structure of our, the next 40 minutes is we're going to be walking you through these 8 key challenges and opportunities with respect to what we found in the literature. And it's really been very fascinating, incredibly illuminating, and I think there's things that for folks on this call or on this webinar will be very surprising, stuff that won't be surprising. But part of our hope with this was that we would be able to create some tools for folks to use for advocacy, for their own research, for thinking about programming, and to kind of get us on the same page about what we know about women's homelessness in Canada. So we'll start with finding 1. Naveen, would you mind giving us one more slide? Perfect. So this is a really, really important one. What we saw in our research was that the number of women and girls and gender diverse folks who are experiencing homelessness in Canada is likely really underestimated. And part of that has to do with how we define homelessness, how we measure it, and how we respond to it. And a big part of the reason that this happens for women is because women's homelessness is a lot more likely to be hidden. So all the research we've seen is showing that women are a lot more likely to rely on informal supports, to kind of exhaust all of those supports before becoming homeless or before entering a shelter system. So there's quite powerful stories of women talking about preferring to stay in an abusive relationship, preferring in quotation marks, to stay in an abusive relationship because they're only subject to the violence of one man rather than the many men that they might experience on the streets. So it's this hidden dimension of women's homelessness that is really distinct and is a very key piece to understanding it. Slide. One of the things that we see, certainly this is probably not a surprise to many of you. We see it in the national data. So the point in time count data consistently shows that women are a lot less likely to show up in shelters than men, are more likely to be in hotels and motels, and a lot of other research demonstrating they're often more likely to be couch surfing or, for example, trading sex for housing. Slide. What is really interesting when you look at some of this emergency shelter data that we have at a national level is that there's about gender equity for children that are in shelters, which you see at the top of the graph there. But as the age increases in a woman's life, she's less and less likely to end up in the shelter system. So the question obviously is where are these women going? We know obviously they are not in some kind of magic other realm where they're experiencing housing markets that are less tight, or housing affordability issues to a lesser extent than men. We know deeply about the feminization of poverty, but they aren't showing up in the homelessness system. Their experiences are a lot more likely to be hidden. Slide. And so we drew together this kind of hopefully helpful infographic to try to demonstrate what we're talking about when we're talking about women's homelessness, and we're often really talking about hidden homelessness. So women are a lot less likely to be living rough, using domestic services, domestic violence services, especially if they have dependent children, because they may fear child welfare intervention if they do enter the homelessness system. So really what we're seeing is women who are stuck in a range of situations in each of these boxes that are experiencing what we define as homelessness, but it is to some extent behind closed doors. So that might be women who are experiencing severe poverty, who are couch surfing, who are living in overcrowded housing, who are experiencing abuse or elder abuse or child abuse. And at a national level, we know that women's experience of core housing need is also much higher. Next slide. So the bottom line for us, in looking at this literature, was really like, okay, what is the scale of women's homelessness then? And because it's so hidden, we really haven't been able to get a sense of that. So what we're trying to do is what you see on your screen, kind of patch together and triangulate various kinds of data sources to get a sense of the scale. But the data we have really demonstrates that this is a very large issue, and that because women's experiences of hidden homelessness often aren't thought of as homelessness, and they're kind of systematically undercounted in the methodologies we have to understand homelessness. So pit counts, for example, or snapshot methodologies really aren't going to get at the experiences that many women are having. And unfortunately, because of this, obviously there's a correlation between measurement and response. Because we're not able to really measure this, it invisibilizes women's experiences and kind of contributes to a lack of investment and prioritization in this area. So when we're thinking about women's homelessness, we also really need to be thinking about how we define it, how we measure it, and how we think about it in a way that's inclusive of the unique ways that women are experiencing it. And our second finding, maybe I'll have Hannah, you jump in here and tell us about the second kind of key piece that we found.
Yeah, so first, next slide, please. Yeah, so the second finding that really came up was that there's a profound lack of safe, affordable, adequate, and appropriate housing for women, girls, and gender diverse peoples and communities across Canada. So it goes without saying there's a gender dimension to the housing crisis in Canada. And this is really carried by women, particularly women of color, Black women, Indigenous women, trans women, and gender diverse people. Can I have the next slide, please? So embodied in this, there's a question of core housing need. CMHC data shows that 35% of women are living in below standard housing compared to 25% of their male counterparts, and 17% of women-led households are in core housing need compared to 10% of men-led households. Core housing need was particularly high naturally for, not naturally, but it goes with it, Indigenous women, for single parents, female-led homes, and homes that were led by older women and younger women. I think it's important to talk about with housing need too, how there is a geographical component to what we're talking about, and that northern communities, Indigenous communities, remote rural communities are often disproportionately affected by the question of housing need too. So I think when we have this conversation about women's homelessness, this is also something we have to bring it back to. With that, women-only trauma-informed housing services are limited and grossly underfunded. So it's kind of what Caitlin was pointing to earlier is that it's important to talk about housing need because ultimately, if the service isn't there to have somebody exit out of this really precarious condition, they're going to stay there. Can I have the next slide, please? So another thing that came up under this finding was the feminization of poverty. So these kinds of disparities are reflected in poverty levels as well, where women are more likely to live on low incomes than men. And particular groups of women are much more likely to have low incomes, including racialized women, women with disabilities, and particularly single parent women. I don't personally think we can talk about the feminization of poverty without talking about the feminization of labor. I think it goes all together. Positions in the service industry are often held by women because of their traditionally, I'm saying this with quotes, feminine qualities and elements of care. Additionally, we need to think about women working in informal economies such as sex work and caregiving positions. These are feminized labor pools, and they have no recognitions when their positions get no recognition when their positions get put on ice because something like a pandemic or an economic crisis. So I think this loops back to thinking about the circumstances of COVID, particularly when we think about evictions, because evictions will disproportionately negatively affect women and single mothers, Black women, Indigenous women, people who often make a huge percentage of the folks in poorly paid service industry jobs and informal economy jobs. Furthermore, it's important to recognize how difficult it is to track these kinds of effects when we're not counting things like evictions or offering supports to these particularly, I guess, more narrowly affected groups. Next slide, please. So the next finding was that there's a lack of women-specific housing and supports, which drive women into emergency shelters and services that do not recognize them as homeless, are not designed to respond to their needs, and are often underfunded and overwhelmed. As a result, many women remain trapped in traumatizing situations of homelessness and violence. So we're illustrating a little bit of the chicken and the egg issue that we've pointed to already. So despite our best intentions, our current emergency-focused response to homelessness and housing need is failing women, girls, and gender diverse peoples. We're currently not providing supports and resources in areas with the highest need, nor to groups facing the most severe forms of marginalization and violence. Some data suggests that we're often not transitioning women from emergency shelters into safe, affordable, adequate housing. So, that's also what we bring up when we talk about ending homelessness for women, and really having a belief in it too, is recognizing the existing systems that are just circling women into the same emergency services that, let's be honest, are often not well adapted to them in the first place. And we're not making a concerted effort to really transition to them to something sustainable. Can I have the next slide, please? So here's some key findings that are basically, they're no surprise. Shelters are systematically operating at overcapacity. The need for shelters and emergency housing for women vastly outpaces the availability. This is clear from StatsCan data, ESDC data, and independent research that all indicates that across both the homelessness system and the violence against women sector, that we're just not able to meet the need. Between 2005 and 2014, the Canadian emergency shelter system was operating at over 90% capacity and at 92% occupancy rate in 2014. Illustrated here, we have women's shelters in Toronto that have been operating at tremendously high rates pre-COVID. In the absence of provincial support for renters, we're going to see increases in homelessness, but we're falling again into that trap that came out in that first finding, which is that we have a crisis of invisibility. So if the services that are typically recording a lot of that visible homelessness, and then they're refusing people, that's a whole slew of increases in homelessness that we're not seeing at all. Additionally, I think when we think about eviction rates that are likely going to go up in really hot housing markets and under the circumstances of the pandemic, we don't have anything methodologically in place to really measure how this is going to happen for some of the most precariously placed people in Canada. Next slide, please. So part of this is obviously the issue of availability and funding disparities. Across Canada, there are less women-specific emergency shelter beds. Across the system, there are 30% dedicated to men compared to 13% dedicated to women. And while there's 38% that are general shelters that may encompass all genders or be co-ed, we also know that women will avoid co-ed shelters for fear of violence or because they've experienced violence within those spaces. So while putting our good foot forward that we believe in ending homelessness for all, and having these more holistically run spaces, the reality of it is that there's a legacy of violence that defines how a lot of women would like to use shelter services, and it still underlines a huge need for women-specific services. Next slide, please. So we have a quote here from a woman discussing violence. I'm just going to quickly read it. They asked me why I don't go to men's. I was like, I did go to men's before, and I was getting sexually harassed all the time. I remember one time waking up at a men's shelter, and there was like 5 guys standing around my bed in the dark, and they were all naked from the waist down. After the sexual assault, I left the building. I never went back. So it just embodies in a more concrete way what is just it's a very real experience that defines why people still really require women-specific services. Next slide, please. So some data suggests we're not transitioning women from emergency shelters into safe, affordable, adequate housing. I mentioned this earlier, where we have this bad habit of just cycling people through emergency shelters when ending homelessness is so much more. We have a very important finding from StatsCan here, who looked at 552 domestic violence facilities operating across Canada. On snapshot day, that was April 18th, 2018, they found that 669 women and 239 children were turned away from shelter, largely because shelters were full. On the same day, they looked at women who were leaving the shelter and found that 21% were returning to the residence with the abuser, 36% didn't know where they were going, and 11% were entering another domestic violence shelter. As a researcher, I think those two first numbers of the 21% and 36% are the things that I really flag, in the sense that, again, we're entering into that problem of the invisibility of homelessness, where individuals are not exiting homelessness simply because they've left the shelter, but they're just entering another form of precarity that is just as concerning as the visible homelessness that we've been measuring forever. And with that, I'll pass it on to Caitlin for key finding number 4.
Awesome, thank you so much. This Statistics Canada study is just very shocking to me, and I like consistently love to talk about it because the numbers are so incredibly stark, and they just they paint a picture of just how profoundly we are failing women who are fleeing violence and seeking shelter. And thank you so much for that, Hannah. Our fourth finding, very similarly or very linked to this, is that homelessness is really uniquely dangerous for women and gender diverse folks. So a lot of folks will ask me, like what is distinct about women's homelessness? And a big piece of this is the high level of violence. So 91% of women in Canada who are homeless have experienced an assault of some kind at some point in their lives. Slide. Oh, yeah, perfect. There we go. There's a great study that I worked on with my colleagues at the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness, where we actually collected kind of the largest data set on youth homelessness in Canada, and we were looking at assault and violence and those kind of experiences, and really found that young women and gender diverse folks are much more likely to have experienced assault of various kinds on the street. So 37% of women, young women in the last 12 months had experienced an assault, compared to 8% of young men. And this was even higher for trans folks and gender diverse folks, as well as LGBTQ2S folks. Next slide. What is also really clear is that the kind of experiences of violence that young women and trans folks are having on the street is a total continuation of what they're experiencing in their home as children. So 73% of young women, as you see there, had experienced some kind of abuse during their childhood. That number is 80% for gender diverse and trans folks. Next slide. And we also know that this violence is also occurring in public systems as well, including the child welfare system. and again, disproportionately affecting Indigenous young women and gender diverse folks. So as you see here, this violence really isn't distributed equitably. In BC, we know data in BC indicates that 60% of children and youth that are experience sexual violence and child welfare are Indigenous. And we see also really high rates of violence against gender diverse and trans young people who are in child welfare. So it's really this kind of repeated experiences of violence that begin in childhood and continue onto the street for many women and gender diverse peoples, and obviously contribute to cycles of PTSD and can contribute to mental health challenges, chronic poverty, intergenerational poverty, as you folks know, no doubt. So it's really critical that we are able to break this link between violence and homelessness in the lives of women and girls. And as we've kind of been speaking about, the importance of lived experts in terms of guiding our policy and practice in this area is going to be really key. And Alex and Hillary, I'm going to turn it over to you folks to kind of comment on some of the data we've talked about from your perspectives and from your area of expertise.
All right, thank you so much, Caitlin and Hannah. In this next section, as Caitlin mentioned, my colleague Hillary and I will just be taking a few moments to flesh out and emphasize some key pillars of the Lit Review just a little bit further. In particular, again, as Caitlin mentioned, lived expertise, gender diversity, and LGBTQ2S+ housing and homelessness. So one of the main goals, sorry, could I get the next slide, please? Thank you so much. One of the main goals of this literature review was to mobilize lived expertise to shape policy and practice solutions. And I wanted to spend some time discussing why this is such an important methodological consideration. This type of progressive approach to research, one that centers the voices of lived experts within a commitment to change making, is so important if we want to end homelessness. Information that doesn't meet the needs and realities of living, breathing community members sits on shelves and gathers dust. The time for this type of passive knowledge gathering is long over. Research that engages with our communities has the potential to be mobilized to mend the gaps that women and gender diverse folks fall through every day. Lived experience is necessary to breathe life and humanity into quantitative data and secondary sources. We, as people who've lived it, can catch things in research plans that don't adequately reflect the lives of real people, or misconstrue fundamental aspects of lived realities of homelessness. Policy and practice that falls short or fails to respond to on-the-ground realities can have serious, life-threatening consequences, as Caitlin mentioned. Having a diverse group of lived experts is equally important. Homelessness is complex, and no two people experience it in the same way. If we want to take the task of ending homelessness seriously, we need to access a wide variety of voices and perspectives. Standpoints are always inherently partial, and we can get a fuller picture of what homelessness looks like and feels like if we can see it from many different points of view. The original Women's Network Research Working Group consisted of multiple individuals with diverse lived expertise, which proved integral at each stage of developing, guiding, and framing this literature review, in both the research and the findings. Our opinions as lived experts and our feedback were not only sought out, but were meaningfully incorporated into the State of Women's Housing Need and Homelessness review that you see today. This type of robust collaborative work is necessary in shaping future research and responses to homelessness. So next slide, please, and thank you. I also wanted to spend some time talking about gender diversity in the broader literature review, and to highlight the importance of critically unpacking how the gendered nature of homelessness my colleagues have discussed impacts gender diverse folks in particular. There's a need for research that is affirming to genderqueer, gender fluid, two-spirit, and non-binary folks. Many of us who don't identify as women find ourselves falling into the umbrella of women's homelessness in a sort of uneasy alliance. Hillary will speak more on the topic of LGBTQ2S plus homelessness, but I wanted to emphasize the importance of specific housing options, resources, and services that are not only welcome, but are affirming to diverse expressions and experiences of gender. The literature review outlines that, and I quote, housing policy rarely focuses on women's realities, resulting in an acute lack of women-only trauma-informed housing services. It's notable that the experiences of gender diverse people are even more likely to be rendered invisible through the sticky web of gendered exclusion. The intensely gendered homelessness landscape does violence to gender diverse folks, and these experiences are compounded by intersecting social locations like race, sexuality, ability, or citizenship. Again, to quote the literature review, these failures within existing emergency systems contribute to cyclical experiences of homelessness, complex trauma, exploitation, violence, and poverty. The state of women's housing need and homelessness is both path-breaking and eye-opening, as gender diversity has yet to be taken up meaningfully in much of the literature on homelessness. Gender diverse people experiencing homelessness not only face multiple intersecting layers of marginalization, but they also face multiple layers of erasure as a result of existing in a space outside of or in between the normative poles of the gender binary. Experiences of homelessness are compounded by cis heterosexism and other structural factors like colonization, racism, or ableism. These oppressive structures that frame both everyday life and the institutions people experiencing homelessness are likely to brush up against are produced and maintained through extreme historical, political, economic, and social power imbalances. Without naming these engines of oppression and how they come to shape our lived world, it's almost impossible to dismantle them. Housing solutions, policy change, and revamping services are vitally important, but these transformations must be made alongside efforts to implement broader social and structural change. The time is now. Ending homelessness depends on it. Thank you. I'd now like to pass you along to my absolutely incredible colleague, Hillary, who will share just a little bit more about LGBTQ2SQ plus housing and homelessness in Canada. Thanks.
Oh, hi, everybody. Yeah, I'd like you to put it on slide 29, please, when you can. Okay, what we know so far is research suggests that 20 to 40% of young people experiencing homelessness identify as LGBTQ2S. We know that this community's youth are at higher risk of homelessness due to homophobia and transphobia in the home, and they often face the same discrimination in the shelter system. LGBTQ2S youth identify the primary reason for homelessness as family rejection due to gender identity or sexual orientation. LGBTQ2S youth are at higher risk of mental health concerns and self-harm and exhibit higher rates of suicide than the general population. Based upon the limited amount of literature available, there are various pathways into homelessness amongst this community. Enhanced vulnerability to family rejection, mental health issues, income disparities, and housing discrimination potentially place LGBTQ2 adults at a greater risk of homelessness. As stated by the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness, discrimination is entwined with homelessness. COH lists 7 impacts of discrimination on the homelessness. I won't go through them all because there are a lot on the findings, but employment discrimination is one, based on sexual orientation, commonly impacts this community in maintaining and maintaining employment. Factors that deny individuals housing also work to impede employment and educational opportunities, and can lead to an increased risk of homelessness via a stable income. Okay, that's a few of them. There's a lot of negativity, and the one that I find is pertinently important: homelessness and discrimination commonly intersect, as discrimination often acts as a structural precursor to homelessness, and in turn the experience of homelessness can lead to being discriminated against. Discrimination occurs when an individual is treated differently than another solely on the basis of some characteristic, or indeed an interplay of characteristics such as race, sexual orientation, religion, physical disability, mental illness, age, citizenship status, gender, and social economic status. Mental health of these individuals. which is including me, by the way. Large Canadian studies indicate that LGBTQS people are more likely than heterosexual to report unmet mental health needs and were most likely to consult mental health practitioners. Studies have found high rates of depression, anxiety, obsessive compulsive and phobic disorders, suicidal thoughts and acts of self-harm, and alcohol and drug dependence among the community. These people are 1 and almost twice as likely to experience childhood maltreatment, interpersonal violence, and personal loss, and are at double risk of developing post-traumatic stress disorder as their heterosexual peers. LGBTQ youth have an increased risk of suicide, substance abuse, isolation, and experiencing sexual abuse. A Canadian study estimated that the risk of suicide among LGBTQ youth is 14 times higher than their heterosexual peers. A recent US study of the community's youth found that 10% of them met the criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder, 15% met the criteria for major depression. A large statistically represented study of trans people in Ontario found that 77% had seriously considered suicide and 45% had attempted. Trans youth were at greatest risk of suicide, as were those who experienced physical or sexual assault. LGBTQS people experience stigma and discrimination, and this stigma can have a variety of negative consequences throughout the lifespan. The accumulated stigma, prejudice, and discrimination to which minorities and marginalized people are exposed to is called minority stress. LGBTQ2S people are also the targets of sexual and physical assault, harassment, and hate crimes. The number of hate crimes in Canada motivated by sexual orientation more than doubled from 2007 to 2008, and were the most violent of all hate crimes. These pressures, as well as the stress of sometimes concealing their orientation or modifying their behavior or appearance in anticipation of homophobia and violence, have a negative effect on mental and physical health. One fact that is important to make, that 10 to 13% of our population identify as LGBTQ2S, and approximately 0.5% identify as transgender. There is no recorded data for the percentage actually of the two-spirit population. Living life in an enclosed environment can be mentally or physically challenging, and in many cases result in illness or suicidal thoughts. It's imperative that people be allowed to be themselves and live fulfilled lives. So when the percentages are published, we must look beyond those reports to get a more accurate picture. Because of this, the same can be held true for our LGBTQ2S homeless population. Based upon the limited amount of literature available, there are various pathways into homelessness for the community. Enhanced vulnerability to family rejection, mental health issues, income disparities, and housing discrimination, homophobia, transphobia, and biphobia, and lack of community support. Now, this is the important stuff, folks. What should be done? Develop housing that meets the needs of LGBTQ2S individuals. A wide range of housing options should be created, such as emergency shelters and congregate supportive housing. But the emphasis should be placed on permanent independent living with supports. Housing interventions should be piloted on a small scale prior to full implementation across the sector. Protect the rights of transgender, gender non-conforming and two-spirit individuals. Enhance the training and support needs of staff in the homeless service sector. Formalize policies that entrench LGBTQ2S rights within the homeless service sector, both at municipal and agency levels. Ensure that these adults with lived experience of homelessness are part of this policy development. Address the multiple layers of oppression that individuals may face using an intersectional approach. Develop a weekly drop-in for this community's adults. Collaborate with the LGBTQ2S youth sector. Develop allyship training opportunities for non-LGBTQ2S adults in the homeless service sector. Collect formalized data on gender identity and sexual orientation with intake procedures. Ensure that LGBTQ2S staff members are supported within the sector. Develop and grow the LGBTQ2S advisory committee and expand it to include greater representation for those with lived experience of homelessness and ensure there is gender parity. For example, transgender individuals, gender non-conforming individuals. This is most important. An LGBTQ2S competent organizations, you'll probably see the pic there. Competent organizations should identify themselves as safe spaces. I suggest a sign on the front entrance which says diverse, inclusive, accepting, welcoming, safe space for everybody. Organizations should show solidarity by supporting and mainstreaming LGBTQ2S programs through participation in and support for LGBTQ initiatives in the community. Images advertised by organizations should be representative of diverse sexual, gender, ethnic, cultural identities, including representations of diverse family models. Service agencies should provide evaluation forms to anyone who uses their service so that LGBTQ2S individuals can provide feedback on whether their experience was inclusive and sensitive to their needs. There must be collaboration with all service providers, shelters, and system of care agencies, and all residents must be supported by agencies across the homeless service sector. Furthermore, all residents must feel comfortable disclosing their gender identity and expression and their sexual orientation. Just a little more here. This is the most important information shared with me regarding specific shelter policy for LGBTQ2S residents. In the needs assessment survey I initiated in Calgary, my participants answered that 17% said there was no LGBTQ2S specific counseling, 21% said there was no focus group committee to help shape policy for shelter guidance regarding LGBTQ2S rights. 20 participants said there was no pride or transgender flags posted around the facility or the safe words infographic. 17 participants said there was no resources or events posted for events in the community, such as pride parades. Now, these flags you see there would be ideal. Number one shows the diversity with people of color and transgender folk. This flag is now the common flag for our community, as opposed to the 6-color pride flag. 2, I call the Safe Works flag, which CAEH has posted on their website. This shows that shelters and/or affordable housing spaces, that they are a safe space for the community to seek services. Thank you. Next person, please.
Hi, thank you so much for that, Hillary. We are going to need like a book on all of these suggestions. That was brilliant. Thank you so much. And Alex, so brilliant. It's really key. This inclusivity piece is really key, and it actually comes together really nicely with our next finding. So would you mind passing it on to the next slide, Naveen? Perfect. Okay, great. So this finding's really rich, so I'm only honestly going to be able to kind of touch on it. But one of the big things that we found in this work was that there are kind of practices and policies and gaps in the VAW sector and in the homelessness sector that in and of themselves and the way they articulate can kind of create particular challenges for women and gender diverse folks and may actually contribute to their housing instability. And in some cases, this is because of particular practices, and in some cases, it's just because of the ways in which they work together. So really briefly, next slide, I want to talk about the gaps. What we do know is that, oh yeah, sorry, next slide, Naveed. Perfect, great. Here's a problem. In some of the areas that have the highest rates of violence against women and the highest rates of housing challenges, we actually don't have very many emergency services at all. So for example, in PEI and Newfoundland and Labrador and the Yukon, there are no women-specific emergency shelters. Next slide. And unfortunately, this is true in the violence against women sector as well. So there really is kind of a dearth of services in areas where we're seeing some of the greatest need. So 70% of Northern Reserve communities, for example, don't have a safe house or any emergency shelters for women who are escaping violence. And those that do are often, as we've discussed, really super overburdened and have to turn women away because of capacity issues. So some of the communities that are suffering the most, we actually are providing the least support for. And a second issue that really kind of came up in our literature review was the eligibility criteria around access to services. So a lot of women talking about not being able to access particular kinds of shelters or services because they hadn't experienced violence recently enough. They hadn't experienced violence at the hands of a partner. They'd experienced it from someone else. So they weren't able to qualify for services, or they hadn't been on the streets for long enough. I remember speaking with a young woman in BC who talked about, she wasn't able to get into housing until she'd been homeless for 6 months. And so we by creating these kind of eligibility criteria, we essentially kind of ensure that various kinds of trauma would continue to occur in her life in this case. And certainly we know, as Alex and Hillary spoke so beautifully too, there really is a huge lack of services for LGBTQ2S and gender diverse folks. Next slide, please. Yeah, so this quote's really important, and I'm just going to read it really quickly because it really demonstrates how women get trapped by some of this eligibility criteria. So this is in the North last year before December. This is a social worker speaking. Last year before December, we had a case of 2 clients. One had to go into a bar and sell herself for a beer so she could walk into detox because she didn't have a place to go. The shelter did not take her because they didn't have a place for her. We're desperately looking for a place for her. So then she said, "Don't worry, I'll manage myself." So finally she called me and said, "I went. I sold myself to a guy. He gave me a beer. He did what he wanted to do. And then I walked into detox." So these are the kind of challenges we're talking about when we talk about capacity issues, eligibility criteria, and kind of the lived consequences of that for women. So the ways in which not just the VAW or the homelessness sector's policies conspire, but also other systems like mental health, like criminal justice, can really create profound hardship. And Alex, Bridges, and Khulud, I'm going to pass it on to you folks to talk about what this looks like for Indigenous women and girls and gender diverse folks across Canada.
Hello. Thank you, Caitlin. That was a very striking slide to read out and hear you tell the story about. So we're going to talk about the key finding number 6, and that is that research on homelessness and housing insecurity largely confirms that Indigenous women, girls, and gender diverse peoples experience the most egregious housing conditions throughout Canada, and they remain the most underserved in both the VAW and homelessness sectors. And we have some statistics on the next slide that we are going to talk about. And so Indigenous women are overrepresented amongst women who are homeless and are more likely to experience hidden homelessness, as was spoken about. They are 15 times more likely to use a homeless shelter than non-Indigenous women, and are overrepresented in domestic violence shelters by about 5 times more than their representation in the Canadian population. And so 21% of Indigenous women live in housing that need major repairs, compared to 7% of non-Indigenous women. Next slide. On top of these challenges, we know that Indigenous women and girls are much more likely to experience violence and to die from violence. The General Social Survey on Victimization found that Indigenous women experienced violent victimization at nearly triple the rate of non-Indigenous women. And violence and housing insecurity are often intersecting and compounding experiences for Indigenous women, girls, and gender diverse people, as has been stated. And so really the literature review is to try to map the layered complexities of oppression and marginalization impacting Indigenous women. And it includes a deep dive on 3 areas. Really, it's the criminal justice, Inuit health and housing on reserves. And these deep dives explore how colonial violence is actualized through systems and institutions that Indigenous women, girls, and gender diverse people are constantly made to navigate. The literature review found that despite the disproportionate violence and housing needs they experience, Indigenous women and gender diverse people remain the most underserved within both the VAW and homelessness sectors across the country. And there is a profound lack of women-focused homeless shelters or VAW shelters in Indigenous communities and on reserves across Canada. And so compounding inequities and the lack of transformational change leads Indigenous women to be hugely overburdened with respect to poverty. And the housing challenges are very complex and varied and interchanging for Indigenous women and girls, and they must be addressed on an urgent and priority basis. Next slide, please. And so we are really trying to focus on these Indigenous knowledge systems. These complex and interrelated issues contribute to housing and homelessness issues. We're seeing the interconnectedness of issues is paramount in addressing or in facing this dilemma. Women and girls are often viewed as knowledge transmitters, life givers. Two-spirited and LGBTQ+ peoples are viewed as knowledge holders and balance keepers in the culture. Indigenous women, girls, and gender diverse peoples face these adversities with important responsibilities that they must carry on. And so the experiences they carry with them are so critically important in planning service delivery and protocols. So they must be heard, included, and honored in any process. Understanding Indigenous knowledge systems, incorporating them into all research and governance work being done is important in bringing a tailored response that serves the communities that they're representing in an effective way. And there are examples that are currently emerging that incorporate Indigenous knowledge, such as a lot of environmental governance that is currently going on tries to include an indigeneity component. There are co-governance committees. In the education system, there are new curriculum that are emerging. And notably, the new impact assessment regulations that came out in 2019 are also more inclusive of Indigenous knowledge systems and gender-specific social impacts that are occurring because of these environmental projects. So it's just going to show that when other points of view and perspectives are brought into the conversation, it really changes how the practices are laid out and perceived, basically. And so we need to ensure that Indigenous people's voices and needs from a grassroots level are included in literature and any research conducted on their behalf. And there's already really good work being done out there in many fields. So we just seek to complement that and complement the growing body of research in a way that honors women, girls, and gender diverse people who really contribute to these conversations. And then I'll pass it over to Khulud.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Alex. I will take it on from here and speak to the technical work that we did in the literature review. And in the literature review, we essentially incorporated Indigenous-led knowledge frameworks to guide our investigation into Indigenous women's and gender diverse people's homelessness in Canada. And let me just say that we were standing on giants, on the shoulders of giants in this regard, because our goal was to stir away from colonial definitions of Indigenous homelessness and survey literature through a lens of systemic and institutionalized colonization that leads Indigenous women into housing insecurity. And we were able to do that through the incredible work of Jessie Thistle on the definitions of Indigenous homelessness and the incredible knowledge in the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls Inquiry Report. So using Jessie Thistle's definition, and next slide, please. Using Jessie Thistle's definition of Indigenous homelessness, we looked at homelessness experienced by Indigenous women and gender diverse people through a composite lens of Indigenous worldviews. And these included individuals, families, and communities isolated from their relationship to land, water, place, family, kin, each other, animals, cultures, languages, and identities. And the key, as Jessie states, was to emphasize that Indigenous people experiencing these kinds of homelessness or these kinds of displacements from land, people, kin, waters, animals, cultures, languages cannot culturally, emotionally, or physically reconnect with their indigeneity or lost relationships. So this component of relationships and all our relations was really key when we were surveying literature and looking at different documents on Indigenous homelessness. And the other knowledge framework that we have adapted to understand Indigenous women's homelessness and housing security is from the MMIWG Inquiry Report. And the report represents the strength and power of Indigenous matriarchs and knowledge keepers, and it was very important for us that the work that we're doing through the literature review builds upon the important work that has already been done. So for the literature review, we adapted the knowledge framework called Pathways That Maintain Colonial Violence from the MMIWG Inquiry Report, and the framework explores 4 systemic and institutional pillars that perpetuate homelessness or colonial violence across 4 key points. So these are historical, multi-generational, and intergenerational trauma, social and economic marginalization, maintaining the status quo and institutional lack of will, and ignoring the agency and expertise of Indigenous women, girls, and 2S LGBTQIA people. And through adapting this lens, this framework, and looking at these 4 pillars, we conducted 3 systems level deep dives in our review. First was on housing on reserve, the second one was on criminal justice system, and the third was on Inuit health. And we tried to map how systems and institutions intersect to create poverty and homelessness for Indigenous women, girls, and gender diverse people, and leading to perpetuation of colonial violence, but also other forms of violence in the lives of Indigenous women. So adapting the framework from the MMIWG report was paired with conducting literature search that was beyond just peer-reviewed articles and included work from community organizations, coalitions, advisory committees, and collectives, something Caitlin has already spoken to. And we wanted to make sure that any Indigenous-led and Indigenous-involved knowledge is captured, and to present the fullest picture of intertwined systems and institutions that perpetuate colonial violence through homelessness and housing insecurity on Indigenous women. So that's one of the key works that we've done through the deep dives that are present in the literature review, and some of the stats and the bigger picture that Alex has already provided. Next slide, please. So, thank you. Awesome. So the literature review is one of the first steps in a larger plan that we have for our work under the Women's Natural Housing and Homelessness Committee. And we, as has already been iterated, and Caitlin has spoken to this phase 3 of the project, but one of the things that I wanted to speak was the guiding principles that we take forth through the literature review and the knowledge that we've collected, and forward into what are the next steps and what are the actions that we want to take. So as has already been stated, lived experience is at the core of our work, and we're constantly working to build capacities within our work to better incorporate lived experience, particularly Indigenous women's and gender diverse people's lived experience. We know that storytelling and experiential knowledge is valuable, and we seek to combine this knowledge and this storytelling methodologies with conventional data collection methodologies to generate research that walks in both worlds and provide insights into the duality of being that Indigenous women, girls, and gender diverse people experience in navigating colonial systems and bureaucratic institutions while maintaining traditional values and beliefs. And I think this right here is very key, because one of the other things, I think, just referring back to what Caitlin had spoken to, was in terms of methodologies and data collection. And I think there is a particular realization that we need to go past or push the envelope on the methodologies that we're currently using to seek out women's stories and gender diverse people stories, particularly Indigenous women and gender diverse people stories that are not just looking out at surveys, or that are not just looking out at focus groups, and we're focusing more on storytelling, art-based methodologies, so on and so forth. So something that we're really interested in. And then finally, we are committed to growing Indigenous-led and Indigenous-focused research and advocacy on housing insecurity and homelessness. And I think that's one of the biggest key pieces that is our takeaways from this literature review, because we have this big body of knowledge and this big systems level piece now that leads us into our next work. So I'm going to just give a bit of an overview on the next steps. We are, Keepers of the Circle is interested in leading and is looking to lead phase 3 of this research project that is being taken by the Women's Housing and Homelessness Network. And to do that, we're doing an engagement series on August 24th and 26th, which is open to Indigenous women, girls, and gender diverse people who want to speak out about their experiences. And this engagement is going to go into figuring out our governance structure and a research methodology that we're hoping to feed into the phase 3 of the project, which would be an Indigenous-led national scope research on Indigenous women, girls, and gender diverse people's housing insecurity and homelessness in Canada. So if you are on the call and you're interested, please feel free to email me or Alex. Our emails are stated on the slides, and it would be amazing to hear from people on that. So thank you so much. I'm going to finish it off here and pass on to the next person.
Hi, beautiful. Thank you so much, Khulud and Alex. That's wonderful. Just in the interest of time, we're going to breeze through our next 2 key findings. And for folks who are interested, you can kind of do a deep dive in the actual document. So next slide. Perfect. Yeah, so yeah, very briefly, but a really key and interesting finding was the connection between mothers' experiences of housing insecurity and homelessness kind of writ large. So what we found is that mothers' experiences of housing precarity kind of create the conditions for intergenerational homelessness. So when we're thinking about addressing the needs of women, particularly mothers and children, we're actually also talking about what it means to end chronic homelessness and intergenerational homelessness. Slide, please. Perfect. Yeah. So yeah, what we saw in the research is that, children's experiences of housing insecurity or homelessness are really predictive of adult experiences. So a lot of you might be familiar with the point in time count data nationally demonstrated that for a lot of folks who are experiencing chronic homelessness, 50% became homeless before the age of 25. And we also know there's a correlation between childhood victimization, like violent victimization, and adulthood. So what this data, when we pull it all together, suggests that if we want to address chronic homelessness, if we really want to address intergenerational homelessness, we need to be starting way upstream with mothers and other caregivers who are taking care of young people, young children, in the midst of poverty and housing precarity. And I mean, certainly, I just very, very briefly wanted to mention that I was looking at pregnancy and parenting folks on the street, met with some agencies in Toronto, and about 5 kind of frontline workers who are working with women experiencing pregnancy while being homeless. And I asked them, like, can you talk to me a bit about what are the experiences of some of these women once they get housed? Like, what does social inclusion look like? Like, what are things looking like for them? And they kind of all stared back at me, and I kind of felt like I'd said something wrong. And they all said, well, I can't remember the last time any of the women we work with got housed. Most of the women we work with have multiple pregnancies and return to the street from the hospital. So these are like tremendous challenges we're facing. And if we're serious about ending homelessness writ large, we really need to be tackling women and single women and women on the street who have children. And lastly, we're just going to have Khulud, do you want to walk us through point 8, and then we'll jump into questions and answers?
Yes, I will be super brief. So next slide, please, on the perfect, just on key finding number 8. Awesome. So just very briefly, I think, as I stated, one of our last key finding is, and I think this kind of ties in all of the other key findings, is that public systems like child welfare and criminal justice system create pathways into homelessness for women and girls and function to trap them in cycles of intergenerational marginalization and violence. And this is happening both within and across systems. And this, as we spoke before, Alex and I spoke to it before, is particularly true for Indigenous women, girls, Two-Spirit, and gender diverse people. And it is deeply evident from the work that we've done in the literature review, and then also the work that's already been done through the TRC and the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls Inquiry Report. And next slide, please. And I think there's many systems that we talk about within the literature review, but I think the one that we really want to touch upon through this presentation is on child welfare. And child welfare is perhaps the most obvious example wherein this cyclical and intergenerational effect is apparent in the research. For example, research demonstrates that losing custody of children is a crisis that precipitates homelessness. Adolescent mothers in care of child protective services are at increased risks of having their children taken into care as well. Children and youth with experiences of child welfare involvement are at greater risks of becoming homeless as young people. And the result is generations of young people being separated from their children and their children's children being apprehended as well, all of which are factors that contribute to trauma and risk of homelessness. And next slide, please. Hence, we have a woman in Yukon explaining in this quote that the social worker that apprehended her as a child was the same social worker that she had when she was was the same. Sorry, I'll go again. This code that social worker that apprehended her child was the same social worker she had when she was in care as a child. And we know that the intersections between child welfare policies and homelessness sector contribute to hidden homelessness for women as well, because they try to avoid shelters, and it makes it difficult for them to access supports that they need to exit homelessness. So when we're thinking through what it would take to end women's homelessness, I think a lot of this data suggests that we need a pretty substantial transformation in public systems, and public systems collectively need to be focused on, and it's not just housing as an individual isolated issue that's going to help us get there when we're talking about ending homelessness. So thank you.
Awesome, beautiful. Thank you so much, Khulud. Okay, we have thrown so much information at you folks. Thank you so much for being here with us. I know Naveen has been looking through some of the questions that you folks have posed. Naveen, does this close sharp at 2:30? Oh, she might be on mute. Well, regardless.
No, where if folks want to stick around, they're welcome to. However, you know, we'll keep this open for however long the lovely discussion goes.
Okay, perfect. So yeah, do you want to kick us off for some questions, and maybe we'll have any of our panelists that want to join by video, feel free to. Yeah, we'll see what you folks are thinking about, what kind of questions you have.
Great. So we've got a few questions. We'll start with the first one. Will researchers seek data about sex workers' experience of homelessness and precarity? This is coming from Scarlett.
Amazing. Yeah, such a great question, Scarlett. So yes, our large national survey we're working on will absolutely be looking at sex work and the ways in which that is intersecting with housing, with the VAW sector, with the homelessness sector, certainly also looking at kind of challenges to access to healthcare, a range of ways that we know that the conditions around sex work and kind of various policies around it contribute to housing precarity. Hannah, I don't know if you want to add any thoughts there.
No, I think you said it well. It was our intent right from the get-go. I remember even when we started the literature review that it was something we wanted to kind of deal with the entanglement of, talking about sex work and in this context. Unfortunately, it's another one of those things that there's so little data that actually narrows in as sex work in any sort of holistic way. So we're hoping, I think, with the survey to rectify a lot of that and give voice where voice is needed.
Agreed. Yeah, so feel free to connect with us, Scarlett. Thank you so much for that.
All right, next question from Julie. How can we continue to center the voices of lived experience during COVID and the ongoing restrictions of connecting face-to-face?
Oh, that's such a beautiful question. That's such a beautiful question. Maybe I'll throw that out to the panel if folks want to join in and have thoughts on that. Hillary or Alex from our lived experience working group, do you folks have any thoughts?
Not really, except to say, this is Hillary here, that lived experience voices should never be silenced. We are the experts after all. So don't silence us even through COVID. We need to talk about it. And I know the groups I'm involved with, they don't silence me at all, especially the network. So that's all I have to say.
Thank you, Hillary.
It's Alex. I think that during COVID, we're presented with kind of a difficult landscape to navigate in terms of access, in terms of the limitation on face-to-face communication. But I think it involves being a little bit more creative in the ways that we try and engage folks. And I think from my experience during COVID, I've been able to connect either via like online platforms like Facebook with people who are lived experts of homelessness or over the phone, and it's not ideal and it's not long-term, and definitely it's not a way to reach everybody, but it's a way of sort of keeping some of those connections alive during this time where isolation is one of the primary things that we're all experiencing. And I think it also highlights some of the things that we need to have in place, like universal access to Wi-Fi, for instance. So there are a lot of policy responses that this is sort of making clear as well as we move into the future. But I think it's something that we, as researchers, as lived experts, as human beings, like we really need to think about these things, because there are a lot of barriers, and we need to do a lot of work to start dismantling them. Thanks for your question.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Alex. I'll also just add that the Women's Network, we're establishing like a lived experience portal on our website, and kind of working with lived experts on what that could look like, what kind of mutual aid networks we could do through that work. And so the network itself can actually be a tool to support folks, either just in terms of building social networks or connecting or doing advocacy work. So please, yeah, sign up to our website and kind of stay tuned that way. Thanks.
Awesome. We've got a question from Nasreen. It has always been interesting that DV shelters are not included in the point in time counts. Is there interest in adding domestic shelters into the PIT?
Yeah, that's a great question. Nasreen, is that right?
Correct. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, thank you so much for that, Nasreen. Yeah, and so part of the challenge for us too was trying to triangulate data from the violence against women sector and the homelessness sector, because they're often very divorced, the ways in which they collect data, and there's often not sharing between the two at a national level or provincial level. I'm not too sure if there are specific interests in terms of merging data collection across the two. What we'll be doing with the national survey is trying to span both systems and drawing together that data, and hopefully developing some like tools and some measurement tools that might be helpful for government to do kind of some of that cross-system work, because we certainly know women are flowing between both systems. It really, I think there is not a great utility in having divorced data, as long as we ensure, obviously, anonymity and confidentiality and all of those good things. But it prohibits us from seeing the scale of the issue and the nature of what's going on when we don't share across those systems. So yeah, I think there's great utility in that. It's a great question.
Question from Rebecca. Is there any data on women experiencing homelessness coming from correctional facilities?
Yes, there are. So we did a deep dive on the criminal justice system and women's homelessness in our literature review. So honestly, our literature review is just, it's kind of a beast. It's 300 pages. But if you're really interested in a particular system, many of them are there, including the criminal justice system. I know that there is a fair amount of data on women's exits from the criminal justice system and pathways into homelessness, that lack of housing supports, employment supports, financial supports are enormously challenging, again, disproportionately affecting Black women, Indigenous women. I'm not sure if other panelists have thoughts on this piece. Okay, sounds like maybe not, but Nisreen, just in the interest of time, what I'd suggest you do is kind of have a look at that criminal justice chapter. There's huge gaps, certainly with respect to Black women, and more broadly, the literature review really revealed like profound gaps around Black women's experiences of housing precarity and homelessness more broadly, but including with respect to criminal justice involvement. but the connections are very strong, and we know that criminal justice involvement is a key pathway into homelessness.
I just collude here, Caitlin. I just wanted to add,
Yeah.
similarly so
Great.
around the deep dive that we did on Indigenous women, girls, and gender diverse people and their interactions with the criminal justice system and how that leads into homelessness, or how women coming out find it difficult to find housing or find rehabilitation or find pathways out of homelessness. So that's there as well. And I think a key piece here, which is kind of relevant to the conversations that are happening right now, is the over-policing of poverty and the over-surveillance of poverty, which we know happens the most to people that are the most visible on our streets, or people who are street involved. And I think these key thoughts and these pieces on discrimination and over policing, over surveillance are captured within the Indigenous deep dive, and I'm sure probably the other whole chapter, the systems level chapter, that's there as well. So there's a lot of key information there. As Caitlin said, it's a bit of a beast.
Yeah, agreed. Yeah, thank you so much, Khalid.
All right, we've got a question from John. Are there per capita stats per province on shelter bed capacity? Some of the capacity stats in provinces like PEI and the Northern Territories are obviously very lacking, but I'd also worry that the more populous provinces actually might have bigger gaps, even though they have more bed capacity.
Yes. Oh, brilliant question, John. Yeah, agreed. So we actually didn't do that calculation, but it would be enormously helpful, and we should, because it's probably is quite likely that there is larger gaps per like based on population, per capita, sorry, in some of the provinces and territories that we're talking about. Yeah, so basically that's to say I don't know, but totally agree. It's a great question, and we'll do it. We'll have a look at that. So please get in touch with us.
We've got a question from Pamela. Are there any successful programs or groups that we could look at as models for practical action?
Yes, absolutely. Maybe I'll turn it to the panelists. You folks will have some ideas about what you're seeing on the ground in terms of what is effective.
All right.
I can speak maybe a little bit to what's effective. I mean, it's a tough call because it's so I work for a large housing and homelessness service provider. We work with people across the gender spectrum, and I think sometimes like finding that golden solution is kind of I think it's the thing we're all sort of chasing after. So defining the one program that's really knocking out of the park is a little bit tricky. I think honestly, like the question has to narrow itself down to a little bit of who specifically we're talking about. I think there's a little bit of a trap when we say what's great programming for women, because that inherently lumps women all into the same category, when really I think for me, when I think of some of like the success stories I've heard, it's often enough people who have been put into programming that is super adapted to their realities. I can't think of anything necessarily off the top of my head, but I think sometimes it's just asking the question of who's meeting people where they're at the best based on their circumstances. Like I think particularly about like aging women in the system, services for trans users, services that accommodate mothers. I think it's sometimes we need to narrow in a little bit more on the individual component.
Yeah, agreed. Beautiful. Maybe Alex Nelson or Hillary, you folks did a beautiful overview of issues around LGBTQ2S folks' experiences of discrimination, the importance of inclusivity in programs. Do you have any suggestions about great practices we should be looking at?
Actually, no, except for the suggestions I already made. There is some shelters. There's some shelters who are LGBTQS available right now, but very few. There's like There's a foster care system in Calgary. There's one in Saskatoon, and I think there's 2 in Ontario. That's it. That's it.
That are focused on supporting LGBTQ2S young people. Is that right?
Yes, yes, that's right.
Gotcha. Okay. We heard a dog bark there.
I'm glad a pet was able to make an appearance.
I know.
It wouldn't be COVID times if there wasn't one on a webinar or presentation. We've got a question from Jesse here. In what ways can this literature review and its findings be leveraged to push for policy changes, especially during this policy window? What should be a policy priority?
Yeah, amazing question. I'm going to quickly circle back because I think Alex Bridges wants to maybe add some points to the previous question about great programming hopefully around Indigenous women and girls. Alex, do you want to step in before I tackle that next one?
Yes, I just wanted to say I am obsessed with that question personally. We are always trying to find the one that really works. And I mean, as a nonprofit organization, we suffer from the limitations of funding and the availability of it, whatever. So I've seen many different awesome programs go by over the years that we wish we could have back again. And it's really just that cycle of funding that really evades us. But I think that a really impactful programming style that I've witnessed in the far north especially is that usually we have we're delivering an employment training program that gave women basically access to partners that we had in non-traditional trades and different skills that they could build. And so we acted as almost like a liaison for different other people to get connected in the community, and it addressed many different issues at the same time. So we were able to provide funding for clothing, like for safety gear and everything, as well as perhaps like moving funds if they needed to relocate to go to a different area or whatever. So just literally these programs were part of actually surprisingly the Harper Times that came through, where he did a lot of employment training grants and funding or whatever. So that's my personal experience, is really that when there are multiple different approaches to solving the same issue, which for us was a lack of economic opportunity. There wasn't a lot of jobs going around or whatever, and people were really not working enough, and they were lacking, and they needed to get those jobs. So we were addressing it from a variety of issues. We had people that were supporting them from a family sense, from a financial sense, and also from a life skills sense, I guess, in a sense. So just something that I've come across personally and I wanted to shout out about. It's really like wearing a lot of different hats at once, which can be very difficult. And so to us, it's something that I'm very passionate about. I always want to try to find the answer. Really, a lot of people have said it, there really is none, but you just try your best, I guess is what I'm trying to get at. So that's my 2 cents.
Absolutely. I mean, certainly, yeah, and I would just add on there that certainly what we know from the literature is like women-led, women-owned solutions, like where you're really deeply involving those who are affected in program design and delivery. Generally has better outcomes than programs that are not, and certainly that's so critical in the Indigenous context as well. And the last thing I wanted to add is in this literature review, in the BEAST one, the 300-page one, each system we have examples of best practices at the end with hyperlinks to programs that have evidence supporting their efficacy. So if there's an area where you're looking for kind of best practices or ideas of programming, that's also a great place to look. Great. Okay, so that was the last question. Going on to Jesse's question, really, really brilliant question. How are we going to use this literature review? What are the priorities? How are we going to amplify it in a helpful way? So certainly we're going to be doing that work in the Women's Homelessness Network. So I would say please join us and or think about how the network can support wherever you're at in your agency or the kind of work you do. Like if it's helpful to have me or another researcher come and present to your board or whomever for 10 or 15 minutes about what we found, we can 100% do that. or meet with your team. Like, so doing that kind of internal work where we're kind of collectively looking at across the country some of these key findings. We'll be doing and have been working on letter writing campaigns around particular issues. We'll be doing a webinar series, so kind of bringing together folks across the country who are working on these issues and trying to convene those conversations and shift the conversation. Certainly, I think we're in this really critical window where we can either double down essentially on our emergency response to this issue, or we can decide to invest heavily in housing, which we know ends homelessness for people of all genders. And COVID, I mean, we know we're going to be seeing distressed housing assets entering the market. I think, from my perspective, a key priority for us is ensuring that those properties are bought up and owned by public in the services of the public, whether that's by government or you know, experiments like land trusts or public ownership, community ownership of affordable housing, with a real gendered lens in terms of how we build that, how we think about it, and then how we allocate units, and ensuring that we're also not excluding women who are experiencing hidden homelessness and maybe aren't showing up at the traditional shelters in your community. So I think we need to be pushing really, really hard on the solution, which is housing, obviously, and working together on this issue. I mean, there's a million things to say. Like, do other folks have ideas on the panel about how we can use this, where to go next in terms of advocacy priorities?
Yeah, so I was going to add, I think going back to the question and really centering it around the literature review, one of the beautiful things about a literature review, when you're somebody who likes to think about policy and advocacy, is that a literature review legitimizes saying we don't know something. And I think when you're trying to develop programming, or if you're trying to mount a proposal for something that otherwise the data isn't really there to sustain it, a literature review will advocate for, we don't know enough about this, but we know it's a problem. And I think our literature review, particularly because it centers lived experience voices and was really made in consultation with what's happening on a ground level, I think it's a very powerful document that people can take and in opportunities where you otherwise would not have been able to cite something. You can take this document, and it's a good chance, if you've seen a gap before, it's there, we've identified it. So take advantage of that. And additionally, if I know the turnaround often enough for mounting proposals for arguing for certain policies can be super short. You know, there was a lot of love and work put into this document. It is articulate. There are extremely accessible sort of summaries done of it. Take advantage of those. Use them wherever it's useful for you.
Yeah, agreed. Yeah, we really tried to build like a 1-pager, a 20-pager, a 40-pager, 300-pager, and then kind of also build out a social media campaign with images and that kind of thing, with the goal that we could all collectively, and I mean this, all of us, including everyone who's on this call, collectively use it in a way that would be helpful. So we're so interested in thinking and working with you folks in terms of thinking about what that could look like. The other quick opportunity I wanted to mention too, in relation to COVID and the moment we're in, is like last year we established housing as a human right in Canada through the National Housing Strategy Act. My hope is a literature review like this can help think through how can we make that meaningful for women and gender diverse peoples in Canada. You know, on the discrimination piece, for example, how is that playing out in the housing system? How can the National Housing Strategy Act help us address that for women and girls and gender diverse folks, and kind of using some of the data and stats that we pulled together in this lit review to do that. But yeah, more broadly, to be quite honest, I feel at your disposal if it would be helpful for us to present this or send an email or support with a grant or anything like that, like we want to do it. So yeah, look us up, send us an email. Naveen, maybe we'll take one more question because I know we're kind of over time here, and one of our lovely panelists had to jump off. But yeah, one more question, and then you all will hear from us again very soon.
Great. All right, so we've got a question from Peter. Have you considered a program called the Homeless Entrepreneur Program and the Homeless Diary Program, which we did with the Blue Door Shelters and 360 Degrees Kids?
Oh, amazing. No, I don't. I know 360 Kids well, and their incredible work. But no, I'm not too familiar with that program and what it looks like, unfortunately, but would love to hear more about it.
Awesome. Well, we've got a couple more questions. We'll pass along the questions to all the panelists, and they'll have a chance at reading them. So thank you so much for submitting them. We appreciate it. But again, if you'd like to reach out to them, they're available on social media. They're available via email as well. We'll make sure that the recording is available and the slides. Will send that to you guys via email as well. Let us know if you would like to hear more, and you can stay updated at the womenshomelessness.ca. You can also follow them on Twitter at WNHHN Network. That's it for us here today. Thank you so much for sticking around for an extra 15 minutes. We appreciate it. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks, panelists.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Enjoy your day.
Thanks.
Thanks.